He had been rehearsing for 3 weeks straight. Every single morning, Michael Jackson arrived at the rehearsal space before anyone else. His dancers would find him already there, already moving, already perfecting every step, every spin, every moonwalk sequence. His choreographer remembers watching him from the doorway one morning, the room still dark except for a single work light. Michael running the same 8, count over and over, his sneakers barely touching the floor, as if gravity was simply a suggestion he had chosen not to follow. He was 25 years old. Thriller had just become the best-selling album in the history of recorded music. He was not just the most famous entertainer on the planet. He was, by almost any measure, the most famous human being alive, and he was preparing to share a stage with James Brown. The year was 1983. The occasion was a television special called Motown 2050 Yesterday, Today and Forever. The show was being filmed at the Pasadena Civic Auditorium in Pasadena, California, on March 25th. It was supposed to be a celebration of Motown records, a night of reunion performances by the label's greatest artists. The Jackson 5 would perform, Marvin Gaye would perform, Smokey Robinson would perform, Diana Ross would perform, and James Brown, who had never actually recorded for Motown but whose cultural shadow touched every soul act the label had ever produced, was invited as a special guest. For Michael, this was not just a television appearance. This was something much more complicated, because James Brown was not simply a musician Michael admired. James Brown was the man Michael Jackson had studied, imitated, dissected, and rebuilt himself around since he was a small child growing up in Gary, Indiana. When Michael was 7 years old, his father, Joseph, had him watching James Brown footage on a small television set in the family's cramped house on Jackson Street. James Brown was what Joseph Jackson pointed to when he wanted to explain what performance was. Not singing, not dancing. Performance. The total surrender of a human body to rhythm. The way sweat looked like proof of something sacred. The way a crowd did not just watch James Brown, but was physically altered by him, pulled out of their seats, out of their ordinary lives, into something that felt, for 3 minutes or 4 minutes or 5 minutes, like pure ecstatic truth. Michael Jackson had spent his entire career trying to understand what that was and how to do it himself. By 1983, many people believed he had succeeded. Some believed he had surpassed it. James Brown was 50 years old in 1983. He had been performing professionally for nearly 3 decades. He had invented funk. He had single-handedly created the sonic and physical vocabulary that made almost all contemporary black music possible. Prince studied him. Sly Stone was terrified of him. When Michael Jackson did the robot, when he did the moonwalk, when he spun and dropped to his knees in that particular way that made audiences lose all rational thought, he was doing a version of something James Brown had built with his own body starting in the 1950s in small clubs across the American South, perfecting it night after night in front of audiences that were mostly black, mostly poor, mostly desperate for exactly what James Brown was selling, which was the radical idea that black joy was not just possible, but unstoppable, that it could not be owned or legislated or contained, that it existed in the body and the body could not be taken away. Michael knew all of this. He knew it the way you know the thing that made you. Which is exactly why, standing in the wings of the Pasadena Civic Auditorium that March night, watching James Brown pace backstage in his sequin jacket, Michael Jackson felt something he was not entirely prepared for. He felt afraid, not of failing. Michael Jackson had moved past ordinary fear of failure sometime around his 12th birthday, when performing in front of thousands of people had become as natural as breathing. What Michael felt that night was something more specific, more personal, more ancient in the architecture of his psychology. He was afraid of being measured against the source. He was afraid that the man who had built the template could see exactly where Michael had borrowed, where he had adapted, where he had taken pieces of James Brown's genius and stitched them into his own identity so completely that he sometimes forgot which parts were originally his. He was afraid that James Brown could see the seams. The show's producers had not planned for a confrontation. As far as the television executives were concerned, this was a celebration, a reunion, a love fest. The kind of feel-good nostalgia program that American audiences reliably rewarded with enormous ratings. James Brown was scheduled to perform his set. Michael was scheduled to perform with his brothers and then return for a solo moment. They would share the same stage in the broad sense, both appearing within the same 2-hour program, but there was no explicit plan for them to be on stage at the same time. What happened, instead, was not planned by any producer or network executive. What happened was James Brown. When James Brown walked onto that stage, the Pasadena Civic Auditorium simply stopped being a television sound stage and became something else. James Brown at 50 was not a diminished version of what he had been at 30. He had simply reorganized his power. The wild, leaping acrobatics of the early years had been replaced by something denser, more concentrated, a kind of gravitational authority that made it impossible to look anywhere else when he was moving. He opened with a burst of energy that pushed the crowd back in their seats. He moved with the particular precision of someone who has done something 10,000 times and has long since burned through any anxiety about it, arriving at a place on the other side of technique where the body simply knows. He pointed at his band, and they responded instantly, reading his gestures the way musicians read sheet music, except faster, with the additional intelligence of shared history, of hundreds of nights together, of a working relationship built on James Brown's legendary insistence on absolute perfection at all times and the absolute certainty that any deviation from that perfection would be noticed immediately. The crowd in Pasadena did not just applaud James Brown. They erupted. They stood. They made the kind of collective noise that comes from something older than appreciation, something closer to recognition. The feeling of encountering a force of nature and having your body respond before your mind can process what is happening. Michael Jackson watched from the wings. He had seen James Brown perform before. He had watched the footage hundreds of times. But watching from 20 feet away, with the sound system pushing James Brown's voice directly into his chest, was different from anything he had seen on any screen. Michael would later say, in an interview that aired several years afterward, that standing in those wings was one of the most overwhelming moments of his life. Not because James Brown was better than he expected, but because James Brown was exactly what he expected, which was something that no amount of preparation could make ordinary. And then something unexpected happened. James Brown turned toward the wings. He had spotted Michael. He knew exactly who was standing there and exactly what that meant. And James Brown was not a man who let meaningful moments pass by without seizing them. He had not built 3 decades of performance on accident. He had built them on the radical belief that every moment on stage was an opportunity that would not come again. That the audience in front of you, in this particular room, on this particular night, had never existed before and would never exist again. And therefore everything you had was owed to them completely. He pointed at Michael Jackson. He pointed at him the way a conductor points at a soloist. The gesture was unmistakable. It said, "Come here." It said, "This is your moment." It said, to everyone in the auditorium who saw it, and to the many millions who would watch it on television in the weeks and months and years to come, "I see you, and I am asking you to step forward." Michael Jackson hesitated. The hesitation lasted perhaps 2 seconds. In the context of that evening, in that room, with that audience and those cameras and James Brown still pointing from center stage, 2 seconds was a very long time. The people standing near Michael in the wings would later describe the look on his face during those 2 seconds as something they had difficulty putting into words. It was not quite fear and not quite joy and not quite determination. It was the expression of someone who has spent his entire life preparing for a specific moment and is now confronted with the fact that preparation and arrival are two completely different experiences. Then Michael walked onto the stage. The crowd responded with a sound that the television audio equipment had not been designed to capture, and therefore flattened badly in the broadcast, unable to convey the physical reality of what 2,300 people produce when they simultaneously understand that they are witnessing something that cannot be repeated. Michael Jackson and James Brown stood 6 feet apart at center stage, facing each other, and the distance between them contained something that the cameras could point at, but not quite reach. What followed was not a competition. It was something more interesting than a competition. Michael began to dance, not the contained, narrative-driven choreography of his music videos, but something rawer and more improvisational, something that looked and felt like a direct response to James Brown's energy. A conversation conducted in the language of movement. He did the moonwalk, which he had debuted publicly for the very first time on this same program earlier in the evening, sliding backward across the stage with that impossible smoothness that had already sent television switchboards across the country into overload with viewers calling to ask how it was physically possible. He spun, he dropped. He did things with his feet that had no official name and existed only as expressions of his body's particular relationship with rhythm. And James Brown watched. This is the part of the story that most people get wrong when they retell it. They frame it as a battle, a competition, a moment of rivalry where two kings fought for the crown. But James Brown's face during those minutes told a completely different story, and anyone who has watched the footage carefully knows what was actually happening. James Brown was not watching Michael Jackson with the calculating attention of a competitor assessing a threat. He was watching with something much more specific, much more personal, much more human. He was watching the way a parent watches a child accomplish something the parent taught them. He was watching with recognition. Because James Brown understood, with the particular clarity of someone who has spent 50 years studying what moves people, exactly what he was seeing. He was seeing his own language spoken back to him in a new voice. He was seeing the tradition he had built, the vocabulary of movement and sound and presence that he had invented in cheap clubs in Georgia and the Carolinas and worked his entire life to perfect, being carried forward by someone who had taken it and transformed it into something new without losing what made it essential. This was not theft. This was not imitation. This was succession. Michael finished a sequence and looked at James Brown. James Brown stepped forward. What James Brown did next has been described many times, and the descriptions rarely capture it accurately because what it actually was is very simple and very difficult to explain simultaneously. James Brown knelt down. Not in an elaborate theatrical gesture, not with the showmanship he normally brought to every movement on a stage. He knelt the way you kneel when something demands it, when the moment has a weight that your legs recognize before your brain does. He took Michael Jackson's hand. He held it up, and then he said something that the microphones did not clearly capture, something that the people in the immediate vicinity heard, but that the television audience could only partially reconstruct from context and lip reading. What he said was a version of this: "You have got it now." The auditorium went silent in the particular way that only happens when a crowd of thousands has collectively stopped breathing. And then it erupted. Not for James Brown, not for Michael Jackson individually, for the moment itself, for the thing that had just happened between them, for the sight of one man recognizing another man's greatness in real time, publicly, without reservation, without the protective irony or competitive deflection that usually governs how famous people interact with each other in front of cameras. What the audience in Pasadena was responding to was the extreme rarity of genuine generosity, expressed at full volume. Of someone choosing to say, "You are the future," in a moment when they could have said, "I am still the present." Michael Jackson was 25 years old. He would go on to release Bad and Dangerous and History, and continue to make music that sold in numbers that had no real precedent in the industry. He would be described in ways that involved words like genius and legend and phenomenon, and those descriptions would be accurate, and they would all trace a lineage back to a man from Barnwell, South Carolina, who figured out in the 1950s what music could do to a human body when it was played with total commitment and complete conviction. James Brown was 50 years old. He would continue performing for the next 23 years, right up until almost the end of his life. Because performing was not what James Brown did for a living. Performing was what James Brown was. The stage was not a place he went to. It was a place he existed most completely, the only environment in which all the parts of his particular human complexity could coexist without friction. In the years after that night, journalists asked James Brown about Michael Jackson frequently. They were looking for rivalry, for the edge of competition, for the story that sold better than the one that was actually true. James Brown consistently refused to give them that story. He spoke about Michael with a specificity and warmth that was different from the generic praise famous people offer each other in public. He spoke about him the way you speak about someone whose work you have actually watched closely, whose development you have actually followed, whose particular gifts you have actually thought about in relation to your own. He said once, in an interview published in a music magazine in the late 1980s, that watching Michael dance was like hearing an echo of something he had started and discovering that the echo had become a voice of its own. He said, "It was the best thing that could happen to anything you built." Michael Jackson gave his own version of that night, many times over the years. And in every version, the thing he returned to was not the moonwalk, or the crowd, or the cameras, or the historic viewing numbers the broadcast generated. What he returned to was that moment of James Brown kneeling down and taking his hand. He said he had not expected it. He said he had gone onto that stage genuinely uncertain about everything, about whether he belonged there, about whether the man who had in some essential way invented him would see him clearly, or would see only the debt. And what James Brown had done instead, he said, was show him that the debt was not a burden. The debt was a gift. The gift of being part of something larger than yourself, something that existed before you and would continue after you, something that you had the particular fortune and responsibility of carrying for a while before passing it on. He said James Brown had given him something that night that no amount of record sales or awards or critical recognition could give you, something that only comes from one human being to another in a moment of complete honesty. He said James Brown had told him he was enough. There are nights in music history that echo forward through time, that keep meaning new things to different people in different decades, that function as more than just performances or spectacles, but as something closer to arguments about what human beings are capable of when they are operating at full capacity. March 25, 1983, in Pasadena, California, is one of those nights. Not because two famous men shared a stage, but because of what one of those men chose to do with the power he held in that moment. He could have made it a competition. He was James Brown. He had earned the right to compete with anyone who stood on any stage anywhere in the world, and he would have won. Because James Brown always won, because winning on stage was not something he did occasionally when conditions were favorable. It was his entire orientation toward existence. Instead, he chose to recognize. He chose to see the young man standing across from him not as a rival to be defeated or a successor to be tolerated or a symbol of his own obsolescence to be resented, but as evidence of everything he had spent his life building, as proof that what he had created was real enough and strong enough to travel through time without him carrying it, as confirmation that the work had mattered. The throne does not disappear when a new king arrives. The throne becomes larger. James Brown understood this the way he understood rhythm, the way he understood what a crowd feels before it, knows what it feels, with the whole body, from somewhere below conscious thought, from the place where truth lives before it becomes words. He knelt down. He held up the hand of the young man who had learned everything from him and made it into something new. And he said, "You have got it now." 300 people in a theater in Pasadena and many millions of people watching on television understood that they had just seen something that had nothing to do with entertainment and everything to do with what it means to be human. To build something, to pass it on, to watch it become more than you made it, and to have the grace to be grateful instead of threatened. That is what James Brown watched. That is what James Brown chose. That is what James Brown was.